Lucas was 9 years old when he understood that the São Pedro orphanage was not a home. It was a trap. And beneath its crumbling floors lay something far worse than neglect, a secret that had swallowed dozens of children whole. The orphanage stood on the outskirts of a forgotten town in the lowlands, a gray building with barred windows and walls stained by decades of rain. 50 children lived there, crammed into damp dormitories that smelled of mold and fear. The food was scarce. The punishments were brutal. But the worst part was not what happened above ground. It was what happened below. Lucas had arrived at São Pedro 3 years earlier, after his parents died in a bus accident on a rural highway. He had no known relatives, no documents proving his full identity, no one who would ask questions if he disappeared. The director, Senor Vargas, was a heavy man in his 50s with small, calculating eyes and hands that were always counting money. He ran the orphanage with the help of 2 guards, former miners who knew how to handle tools, tunnels, and silence. For the first 6 months, Lucas lived a relatively normal orphanage life. Chores, poor meals, cold showers, strict rules. He thought this was all there was. Then he turned 8, and everything changed. One night, Senor Vargas came to the dormitory and called out 5 names. Lucas was one of them. The chosen children were led downstairs, past the kitchen, past the storage rooms, to a heavy metal door Lucas had never noticed before. Beyond that door was a staircase descending into darkness. And at the bottom was the mine. It was not an official mine. It had no permits, no safety regulations, no inspectors. It was a clandestine excavation that had been operating beneath the orphanage for over a decade, hidden from the world, sustained entirely by the labor of children no one would miss. The tunnels were narrow, too narrow for adult workers. Only small hands could reach the veins of minerals embedded deep in the rock. Only small bodies could crawl through the tight passages where the most valuable deposits lay hidden. The children worked in shifts, 12 hours underground, 4 hours of rest, then back down again. They used pickaxes too heavy for their arms. They carried buckets of stone that scraped their shoulders raw. They breathed air thick with dust that burned their lungs and left them coughing blood into their sleeves. The tunnels were lit by a few weak bulbs strung along the walls, casting long shadows that made everything look like a nightmare. In the deeper sections, there was no light at all. Children worked by feel, their fingers bleeding as they clawed at the rock. Some collapsed from exhaustion and were dragged back to the surface. Some developed chronic coughs that never went away. Some simply disappeared, buried in cave-ins, or taken to a separate tunnel that no one ever returned from. Lucas learned quickly not to ask questions, not to complain, not to cry. Crying made Senor Vargas angry. And when Senor Vargas was angry, children were sent to the deep shift, the lowest, most dangerous tunnels, where the air was so thin that every breath felt like drowning. For 2 years, Lucas survived by making himself useful. He was small enough to reach the tightest spaces, fast enough to meet his daily quota, quiet enough not to draw attention. But he never stopped noticing. He noticed that some children worked the same shift for weeks without ever coming back up. He noticed that the guards kept detailed logs of which children produced the most and which ones were expendable. He noticed that Senor Vargas received regular visits from well-dressed men who inspected the tunnels like they were examining livestock. And one night, Lucas noticed something that changed everything. It was during a rare moment of rest between shifts. Most of the children were too exhausted to move, lying in the dirt with their eyes half closed. But Lucas had learned to stay alert. He had learned that the guards were less careful when they thought no one was listening. That night, he heard Senor Vargas talking to one of the well-dressed visitors near the mine entrance. "The boy in tunnel has been coughing for weeks," the visitor said. "He is no longer productive. I will move him to permanent assignment," Vargas replied. Lucas knew what that meant. Permanent assignment was the euphemism for children who were sent to the deepest tunnels and never brought back. No one knew exactly what happened to them. Some said they were left to die in sealed-off sections. Others whispered that their bodies were used to shore up unstable walls. "And the new ones?" the visitor asked. "5 arrived last month," Vargas said. "I will start them next week. The younger ones adapt faster." Lucas felt his stomach turn. New children. Younger children. The cycle would never end. But it was the next sentence that made his blood run cold. "What about the boy Lucas?" the visitor asked. "He has been here long enough. Strong. Efficient. Perfect for permanent." Vargas nodded. "I will transfer him tomorrow night." Lucas pressed himself against the tunnel wall, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain they would hear it. But the men moved on, their voices fading into the deeper sections of the mine. Lucas understood instantly. If he did not escape that night, he would disappear forever into the tunnels beneath São Pedro. No one would ask questions. No one would search for him. He would become another nameless ghost buried in the dark. He had to run. That night, Lucas waited until the guards changed shifts. It was the only moment of confusion, the only gap in their routine. He moved quietly through the dormitory, careful not to wake the other children. He took nothing with him except the clothes on his back and a small photograph of his parents he had kept hidden for 3 years. The orphanage had a back door that led to the storage yard. It was usually locked, but Lucas had noticed weeks earlier that the lock was rusted and weak. He worked it carefully with a piece of metal he had stolen from a mine, and after several tense minutes, it gave way. He slipped outside into the cold night air. For the first time in 2 years, he was above ground after dark. For the first time in 2 years, he could see stars. He ran. He ran through empty fields and dirt roads, his lungs burning, his legs shaking. He had no plan, no destination. He only knew he had to get as far from the orphanage as possible before sunrise, when they would discover he was gone. By dawn, Lucas was completely lost. He had been running for hours, moving instinctively away from the town, away from roads, toward the wild lands no one visited. His body was failing. His hands were still bleeding from the mine. His throat was raw from breathing hard. And then he saw it. Ahead of him, the landscape changed. The dry fields gave way to wetlands, a vast expanse of dark water, tangled vegetation, and thick mist that clung to everything like a living thing. The swamp. He had heard the guards talk about it. A dangerous, forgotten place where the ground was never solid, where the water hid sinkholes deep enough to swallow a person whole, where no one went because no one ever came back. It was the perfect place to hide. Lucas stepped into the water. It was cold and dark, reaching up to his knees. The mud beneath sucked at his feet with every step. Strange sounds echoed through the mist, birds he could not see, insects that buzzed too close to his face, the distant splash of something large moving through the reeds. He kept walking. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, burning through the mist, but never fully dispelling it. Lucas moved deeper into the swamp, using fallen logs as bridges, testing the ground carefully before trusting his way to it. He was weak, dizzy. His vision was starting to blur. And then, through the fog, he saw something impossible. An island. It was small, no larger than a house, rising just above the waterline. Thick vegetation covered it, twisted trees, hanging vines, dense undergrowth that made it look like it had been there for centuries, untouched and forgotten. Lucas waded toward it, using the last of his strength to pull himself onto solid ground. For the first time since his escape, he allowed himself to collapse. He lay on the damp earth, gasping for breath, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. He thought he might die there. He thought maybe that would be better than being dragged back to the mine. But then he heard something that made him open his eyes. A creaking sound, wood shifting in the wind. Lucas sat up slowly and looked around. Through the dense vegetation, partially hidden by roots and mud, he saw a structure. A cabin. It was old, built from dark, weathered wood that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding trees. The roof sagged in places, and vines had grown over the walls, but it was still standing. Lucas approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. He pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dim and cool. The air smelled of damp wood and old fabric. But it was not abandoned in the way Lucas had expected. Everything was arranged carefully, deliberately. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a faded blanket folded neatly at the foot, shelves lined with jars of preserved food, their labels yellowed but still legible, a water barrel in the corner covered with a wooden lid. And along the walls were objects that did not belong in a forgotten swamp cabin. Children's toys, a wooden horse with a carved mane, a set of tin soldiers, a worn leather ball, photographs in simple frames, a man and a woman smiling, a young boy between them no older than Lucas, laughing at something outside the frame. And on the table, placed carefully in the center, was a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was neat and deliberate. Para crianca que encontrar este refugio. For the child who finds this refuge. Lucas's hands trembled as he picked it up. He opened it carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The words were in Portuguese, written in the same careful hand. To the child reading this, "My name is Miguel Torres. I built this cabin many years ago, in a place where no one would think to look. I built it for my son, Gabriel, who loved adventure and wild places. Gabriel died when he was 10 years old. An accident, a moment of carelessness, a lifetime of regret. After he was gone, I could not bear to destroy the things we built together. So I left them here. I stocked the cabin with supplies. I made it a place where a child could survive, could hide, could breathe. I do not know who you are or why you are here. But if you have found this place, it means you needed it desperately. Stay as long as you must. The food will last. The water is safe. The island is hidden. And when you are strong enough, there is a radio beneath the floorboards under the bed. It still works. There are people who will help you. Their names and frequencies are written on the back of this letter. You are not alone. Even here, in the middle of nowhere, you are not forgotten. Miguel Torres." Lucas read the letter 3 times before he allowed himself to believe it. Someone had prepared this place. Not randomly, not carelessly. Someone had built a refuge for a child who had nowhere else to go. For the first time since his parents died, Lucas felt something break open inside his chest. Not fear, not pain, but something warmer and more fragile. Hope. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. Then he walked to the bed and knelt down, running his hands along the floorboards until he found the loose one Miguel had mentioned. Beneath it was a small compartment. Inside was a battery-powered radio, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. Beside it was a notebook with a list of names, frequencies, and brief descriptions. Father Antonio, São Luís Church, helps children in danger. Dr. Carla Mendez, free clinic, no questions asked. Attorney Rui Costa, child protection cases, will fight for you. Lucas stared at the list for a long time. These were real people. People who had agreed to help children like him. People Miguel Torres had trusted. But using the radio meant exposing himself. It meant risking that the wrong people might hear. It meant trusting adults again, after everything he had learned about how easily adults could betray. Lucas was not ready to make that choice yet. For now he needed rest. He needed to heal. He needed to feel safe. He lay down on the narrow bed, pulling the faded blanket over himself. It smelled faintly of soap and sun, as if it had been washed and carefully stored. For the first time in 2 years, Lucas slept without fear. But in the middle of the night, he woke to a sound that made his blood freeze. Footsteps. Outside the cabin. Slow. Deliberate. Circling. Lucas held his breath, his eyes wide in the darkness. The footsteps moved around the cabin, pausing occasionally, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was examining the structure. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. Lucas waited, his heart hammering in his chest. And then he heard it. A voice. Low. Rough. Distant, but unmistakable. "We know you are out here, boy. You cannot hide forever." It was one of the guards from the orphanage. They had found the swamp. They were searching the islands. Lucas pressed himself against the wall, trying to make himself invisible. The cabin was hidden by vegetation, camouflaged by years of growth. But if they searched systematically, they would eventually find it. The voice called out again, farther away now. Senor Vargas is offering a reward. Anyone who brings you back gets double pay. Think about that. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the island, back toward the water. Lucas waited until the sounds completely faded before he dared to breathe again. They were close. Too close. The island was no longer as safe as he had thought. He had a choice to make. Stay hidden and hope they never found the cabin. Or use the radio and risk everything to expose what was happening beneath Sao Pedro. Lucas looked at the letter again, at Miguel Torres's careful handwriting. You are not alone. For the first time in years, Lucas allowed himself to believe that might be true. He reached for the radio.